There is a German archaeologist in 1906 on a hillside in central Turkey. His name is Hugo Winkler. He is 43 years old. He has been an academic specialist in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing of the ancient Near East, for almost his entire adult life. He has read tablets from Babylon and Assyria. He has corrected the translations of his colleagues. He has spent years in libraries and museums, deciphering small fragments of clay. But he has never done much field work. He is not, by training or temperament, an excavator. He is a reader of texts. Yet here he is, in the Anatolian plateau, in a place called Bagazkoy, 200 kilometers east of the modern Turkish capital. He has come because of a tip. A few clay tablets, written in cuneiform but in a language nobody recognizes, have been turning up in the antique markets of Istanbul. They appear to come from this region. Winkler has been sent to investigate. He begins to dig. Within days, his workers are pulling tablets out of the ground. Within weeks, they are pulling tablets out by the thousand. Within months, they are pulling them out by the cartload. Hugo Winkler has stumbled, almost accidentally, onto one of the great archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. He has found the lost capital of the Hittite Empire. To understand what Winkler had found, you have to understand what was, and was not, known about the ancient world in 1906. By the start of the 20th century, scholars knew a great deal about ancient Egypt. The hieroglyphs had been deciphered 80 years earlier by Champollion. The tombs of the pharaohs had been excavated. The Rosetta Stone sat in the British Museum. Egypt's history was, in broad outline, understood. Scholars also knew a great deal about ancient Mesopotamia. The cuneiform writing of the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Babylonians, and the Assyrians had been deciphered through the 19th century. The libraries of Nineveh and Babylon had been dug up. The names of the kings were known. The chronology was, in broad outline, understood. And scholars knew a great deal about the ancient Hebrews, the Phoenicians, the Greeks. The Bible, the Iliad, the writings of Herodotus, these had been studied for 2,000 years. The Mediterranean world of antiquity was, in broad outline, understood. But there was a problem. Scattered through the records of all these civilizations, there were references to a people whom nobody could identify. The Egyptians wrote about them in inscriptions on temple walls. The Bible mentioned them more than 50 times. Assyrian kings boasted of having fought them. Greek historians referred to them in passing. The Egyptians called them the Hator or the Kati. The Hebrew Bible called them the Hittites, the children of Heth, the sons of a man named Heth who appeared in Genesis. They were described as a powerful people, with chariots and bronze weapons. They were described as enemies and allies and trading partners. They were described as living somewhere to the north of Syria, in a region that the ancient writers called the land of Hatti. But where exactly? And what language did they speak? And what was their history? And what had become of them? Nobody knew. In the 19th century, scholars had begun to suspect that the Hittites might have been a more significant power than the surviving references suggested. The Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II, in the 13th century before the Common Era, had carved enormous inscriptions about his battle with the Hittite king at a place called Kadesh. He claimed to have won a great victory. The Hittite king was named Muwatalli. The battle was clearly a major event. But who were these Hittites? Where had they come from? Where had they gone? A few clues had emerged. Strange stone monuments, carvings of warriors and lions and divinities, in a style that resembled neither Egyptian nor Mesopotamian art, had been noticed in central Anatolia since the early 19th century. Some had inscriptions in an unknown writing system, a series of strange pictographs that nobody could read. In the 1880s, a British scholar named Archibald Sayce had proposed that these inscriptions and these monuments were the work of the missing Hittite civilization. He had argued that the Hittite homeland was in Anatolia, in what is now Turkey, and that they had once been a great power, equal to Egypt and Mesopotamia. His proposal was speculative. There was no proof. But it was reasonable. And then Hugo Winkler, in 1906, went to Bagazkoy and started digging. What he found was a city. A huge city, spread across an area of nearly 2 square kilometers, surrounded by walls that had once stood 8 meters high. Inside the walls were temples, at least 30 of them, some enormous. There were palaces. There were grain storage facilities. There were ceremonial gates carved with statues of lions, statues of sphinxes, statues of armed warriors. The city had been built on a series of rocky hills overlooking the Anatolian plateau. The walls followed the contours of the land, going up and down with the terrain, creating a fortification that took advantage of every cliff and outcropping. There were elaborate gateways through the walls, each one defended by towers. There were tunnels, postern gates that allowed defenders to slip out behind attackers. There were underground granaries that could store grain enough to feed the population for a year of siege. This was, in its day, one of the largest cities in the world. Perhaps 50,000 people had lived here. It was the capital of a major empire. It had been built on a hilltop in central Anatolia. It had been abandoned, apparently in haste, sometime in the late 13th or early 12th century before the Common Era. It had been burned. The walls had partially collapsed. The temples had been gutted by fire. The palaces had been emptied of anything valuable. Within a few generations of the destruction, the local memory of the city was gone. By the time the classical Greeks and Romans wandered through Anatolia, 1,000 years later, no one in the region had any idea what these ruins were. They were called by various local names. They were assumed to be the remains of some long-vanished people. They were left to the goats and the weather. For 3,000 years, the city sat there. Empty. Forgotten. The bones of one of the great empires of the ancient world, waiting to be remembered. But what made Hattusa truly remarkable, what made Winkler's discovery one of the great events of 20th century archaeology, was what was found inside the burned palaces. Tablets. Clay tablets. By the tens of thousands. The Hittites, like the Babylonians and the Assyrians, had written on clay. They had taken soft, wet clay, pressed marks into it with a reed stylus, and then dried or fired the tablet to make it permanent. The marks were cuneiform, the same wedge-shaped script used across most of the ancient Near East. The Hittites had borrowed the writing system from their Mesopotamian neighbors and adapted it for their own languages. The tablets at Hattusa had been stored in the city's libraries and archives. There were administrative records, inventories of grain, lists of soldiers, accounts of taxes received. There were religious texts, prayers, rituals, mythological narratives. There were legal documents, treaties, royal decrees, court judgments. There were letters, diplomatic correspondence between Hittite kings and the rulers of Egypt and Babylonia and Assyria. There were historical chronicles, accounts of military campaigns and royal successions. There were instructions for ceremonies, for divinations, for the proper way to bury a king. There were, in total, more than 30,000 tablets and tablet fragments. This was an enormous quantity of text. By comparison, the surviving corpus of ancient Greek literature, from all periods, is perhaps a few hundred works. The corpus of surviving Egyptian texts is similarly limited. The Hittite tablets, when they were all read, would multiply by several times what was known about the political and diplomatic history of the Late Bronze Age. But, and here was the catch, the tablets were unreadable. Not the cuneiform script, which was familiar. The script itself was known. The problem was that the tablets were mostly written in a language that nobody had ever encountered. A language that, on first inspection, did not seem to be related to any of the known languages of the ancient world. It was not Sumerian. It was not Akkadian. It was not Hurrian. It was something else. Winkler had found a vast library in an unknown tongue. The work of reading the tablets took years. The breakthrough came in 1915, in the middle of the First World War. A Czech linguist named Bedřich Rosny, working at the University of Vienna, identified the language of the tablets as Indo-European. This was a shock. The Indo-European language family includes most of the major languages of Europe: English, German, French, Russian, Greek, Latin, as well as Persian, Sanskrit, and many of the languages of northern India. It is an enormous family, spread across an enormous geographic area. But until Rosny's discovery, the family had not been thought to extend back into the ancient Near East. Egyptian was not Indo-European. Akkadian was not. Sumerian was not. Hebrew, Phoenician, Aramaic, none of them were Indo-European. But Hittite was. Rosny demonstrated this by identifying a few key words. The Hittite word for water was water. The Hittite word for bread was something like ezatani. The Hittite word for to take, da-, looked suspiciously like the Latin do, I give. Rosny worked through the texts, finding more and more words that matched what would be expected if the language were Indo-European. By the end of his analysis, the case was overwhelming. Hittite was a sister language to Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, English. It was older than all of them, in the sense that it was attested earlier. The Hittite tablets dated to the 15th, 14th, 13th centuries before the Common Era, far earlier than the earliest surviving Latin, Greek, or Sanskrit texts. The Hittites were, in fact, the oldest attested Indo-European-speaking people in the world. This discovery transformed the historical linguistics of an entire continent. It pushed the documented presence of Indo-European languages back by 1,000 years. It opened up new questions about where the Indo-European family had originated, how it had spread, and how the various branches were related to each other. Within a few years, scholars were reading the Hittite tablets in detail. They were translating the diplomatic correspondence. They were reconstructing the Hittite religious calendar. They were tracing the history of the Hittite royal family back through 20-some generations. The empire that had been lost for 3,000 years was, slowly, coming back into view. So who were they? Where had they come from? How had they ended up in central Anatolia? These are questions that scholars are still working on. The basic outlines, though, are now reasonably clear. The Hittites were not the original inhabitants of Anatolia. The original inhabitants were a people we today call the Hattians, who spoke a non-Indo-European language. The Hattians had lived in central Anatolia for at least 1,000 years before the Hittites arrived. They had cities, agriculture, religion, art. They were the cultural substrate on which the Hittite civilization was built. the Indo-European-speaking ancestors of the Hittites arrived in Anatolia sometime in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, perhaps around 2300 or 2200, perhaps a little earlier. They probably came from the north, from the steppes around the Black Sea, in waves of migration that spread the Indo-European languages across an enormous area. When they arrived in Anatolia, they encountered the existing Hattian civilization. Over the next few centuries, the two peoples merged. The Indo-European newcomers became the new aristocracy. The Hattian population continued to live in the same places, speak its own language for some time, and contribute much of the religious and cultural inheritance that the Hittites would later claim as their own. By around 1700 before the Common Era, the merger was complete. A new political entity had emerged. A king named Hattusa, taking his name from the city of Hattusa, which had originally been a Hattian settlement, had united the local kingdoms of central Anatolia into a single state. The name of the people was now Hittite, derived from the Hattian word for their land. The language was Indo-European, but heavily influenced by Hattian vocabulary, especially in religious matters. The religion was a complex synthesis of Hattian, Hurrian, and Indo-European traditions. The art and the architecture borrowed from neighbors in every direction. The Hittites, in other words, were not a single ethnic group conquering and replacing another. They were a hybrid civilization, formed by the slow interaction of multiple peoples over many centuries. By the time their empire reached its peak in the 14th century before the Common Era, they had become something distinctive, neither purely Indo-European nor purely Anatolian, but a fusion of both, with their own language, their own gods, their own art, their own way of organizing the world. The empire, when it emerged into the full light of history around 1600 before the Common Era, was a serious force. The first great Hittite king whose deeds are known in detail is Mursili I, who reigned in the early to middle 16th century before the Common Era. Mursili led a campaign southward that reached, eventually, into Mesopotamia itself. In about 1595, his armies sacked Babylon. They brought down the dynasty of Hammurabi, the very dynasty that, 300 years earlier, had produced the famous law code we now call the Code of Hammurabi. The Hittites looted Babylon, carried off statues of the gods, and went home. This was, by the standards of the day, an astonishing achievement. To reach Babylon from central Anatolia required a march of more than 1,000 kilometers, through Syria and Mesopotamia, with a large army, in the face of all the resistance that any sensible local king would have offered. The Hittites had done it. They had reached the most prestigious city of the ancient Near East and they had sacked it. After Mursili, the Hittite Empire entered a period of decline. There were succession crises. There were civil wars. The frontier kingdoms broke away. For about a century, the Hittites were a shadow of their former selves, struggling to maintain control over even their core territory in central Anatolia. Then, in the late 14th century before the Common Era, the empire was reborn. A king named Suppiluliuma I, and we will have more to say about him in the next part, rebuilt the army, reasserted control over the rebellious provinces, and extended Hittite power across the entire eastern Mediterranean. By the end of his reign, the Hittite Empire was one of the four great powers of the Late Bronze Age, alongside Egypt, Babylonia, and Assyria. It controlled most of Anatolia, much of northern Syria, and significant trade routes leading into Mesopotamia and the Levant. This was the empire that would, a generation later, face the army of Ramses II at Kadesh. The empire that would sign the first written peace treaty in human history. The empire that would burn and vanish and be forgotten. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The story of the Hittites at their height, their military, their religion, their daily life, their famous iron, is for the next part. In a museum in Ankara, behind a glass case, there is a small clay tablet. It is about the size of a hand. Its surface is covered in tiny wedge-shaped marks. It is roughly 3,300 years old. It was written by a Hittite scribe in a city whose name had been forgotten. For 3,000 years, in a language that nobody alive in 1900 could have read. The scribe pressed the marks into the wet clay carefully, line by line. He pressed his name into the clay too, at the end of the text. His name was Anusharuma. He probably had a family. He probably lived in a small house near the palace. He probably never thought, as he wrote, that anyone 3,000 years later would be reading his words. But here we are, 3,000 years later, reading them. Tomorrow night we will look at the Hittites at their height. The chariots, the iron, the storm god, the way they made war, and the way they made peace. But tonight, rest. Good night. It is morning in Hattusa. The year is somewhere around 1330 before the Common Era. The sun has come up over the Anatolian plateau. The air is cold. Hattusa sits at an altitude of more than 1,000 meters, and even in summer the nights are cool. The smoke of 1,000 household fires rises from the city. Bread is baking. Animals are being milked. Soldiers are assembling at the gates for the morning drill. We are going to spend tonight inside the empire. The Hittites at their height. Their work, their war, their worship. At the center of Hittite society was the king. He was not, like the Egyptian pharaoh, considered a god. He was a man, born of human parents, who would die a human death and be buried in a royal tomb. But he was the chosen of the gods. His position came directly from the storm god, the chief deity of the Hittite pantheon. The king's primary duty was to mediate between the gods and the people. He performed the great seasonal rituals. He led the army into battle. He sat in judgment over major legal cases. He received foreign ambassadors. He corresponded with the kings of Egypt and Babylon. The Hittite king was not absolute. He shared power, to a significant degree, with a council of nobles called the Panku. The Panku had real authority. It could be consulted on important decisions. It could, in extreme cases, depose a king who had committed serious crimes. The Hittite system was not democratic. The king was still the king, but it had checks and balances that were unusual for the ancient Near East. Compared to the absolute autocracy of pharaonic Egypt, the Hittite king lived under real constraints. The succession was, in theory, hereditary. But it was complicated. The king did not necessarily pass the throne to his eldest son. He could choose among his sons. He could choose a brother or a nephew. The choice was often controversial, and a great deal of Hittite political history consists of succession disputes, princes contending for the throne, civil wars breaking out, kings being assassinated by ambitious relatives. The most famous early Hittite document, called the Edict of Telepinu, is essentially an attempt to fix the succession rules to prevent the kind of bloody family conflicts that had nearly destroyed the empire in its first century. Below the king came the great families. The aristocracy. These were the men who commanded the army units, who governed the provinces, who held the major priesthoods. They lived on estates given to them by the king, worked by tenant farmers, and they were expected to provide military service in return. They were the backbone of Hittite power. Below the aristocracy came the free citizens, the farmers, the craftsmen, the merchants. They paid taxes, performed corvée labor for major royal projects, and provided soldiers for the army. Their lives were probably not very different from those of free people in contemporary Egypt or Mesopotamia. They worked. They married. They had children. They worshipped the gods. They died and were buried. And below them came the slaves. Hittite society included slavery, like all the ancient societies we know of. The slaves were mostly war captives, brought back from Hittite military campaigns and assigned to royal estates, temple lands, or aristocratic households. They could, in some circumstances, marry free citizens. Their children might be free. The Hittite legal codes, and we have them, distinguish carefully between offenses committed against free citizens and offenses committed against slaves, with different penalties for each. It was a hierarchical society. It was a stable society. For its time, it was a reasonably well-organized society. And it was held together, at the top, by the king. The Hittites were, above all else, a military power. Their empire had been built by conquest, and it was maintained by conquest. Every year, in the campaigning season, from spring through autumn, when the roads were passable and the harvests were in, the Hittite king led an army into one or another of the empire's frontiers. The army would march, fight battles, sack rebellious cities, collect tribute, and return home before the snows closed the mountain passes. The core of the Hittite army was the chariot corps. The chariot was the most important military technology of the Late Bronze Age. It had been developed sometime around 2000 before the Common Era, somewhere in the Eurasian steppe, probably by an Indo-European-speaking people whose languages would eventually give rise to Hittite, Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and the rest of the Indo-European family. The chariot spread rapidly across the ancient world. By the Late Bronze Age, every major military power in the Near East had chariot forces. Egypt had them. Babylonia had them. Assyria had them. The Hittites had them, and they used them brilliantly. A Hittite war chariot was a light, fast, two-wheeled vehicle drawn by a pair of horses. It carried 3 men, a driver, an archer or spearman, and a shield-bearer to protect them both. The Egyptians, by contrast, used 2-man chariots without shield-bearers. This was one of the differences that mattered at Kadesh. The chariot was a mobile platform that allowed soldiers to move quickly across a battlefield, to engage and disengage at will, to deliver volleys of arrows or spear thrusts and then withdraw before the enemy could close. Chariots were expensive. A single chariot required a substantial financial investment, the vehicle itself, the horses, the training of the crew, the bronze armor. A chariot corps could be raised only by a wealthy state with an organized economy. The Hittites had such a state. At its peak, the Hittite army could field perhaps 3,000 chariots, a force larger than anything the Egyptians or the Mesopotamians could match. The Hittite king himself usually rode in a chariot at the head of his army. He was, in a literal sense, a chariot warrior. The royal ideology celebrated him as a hunter, a fighter, a man of speed and strength. The carved reliefs at Hittite sites show kings driving chariots, shooting bows, riding into battle. This was their image of themselves. This was how they wanted to be remembered. Beyond the chariots, the Hittite army had infantry, masses of foot soldiers carrying spears, bows, slings, and short swords. They were not, in general, as well equipped or as well trained as the chariot crews, but there were many of them. Hittite armies on major campaigns could number 10,000 or more men. And then there were the auxiliaries. The Hittite Empire was a multi-ethnic confederation, and many of its subject peoples were obligated to provide troops in time of war. There were Kaska tribesmen from the northern mountains. There were warriors from the Hurrian states of northern Syria. There were levies from the smaller kingdoms of western Anatolia. A Hittite army on a major campaign might include a dozen different ethnic contingents, speaking half a dozen different languages, fighting under a single command. The empire ran on its army. The king's prestige, the loyalty of the nobles, the obedience of the subject peoples, all of it depended on the army winning. There is one specific Hittite military advantage that has become famous, and that deserves its own discussion. The Hittites were among the earliest peoples in the world to work iron. For most of the Bronze Age, that is, for most of the time from roughly 3000 to 1200 before the Common Era, the metal that mattered was bronze. Bronze is an alloy of copper and tin. It was the material of the weapons, the armor, the tools, the cooking pots, the agricultural implements of the entire ancient world. Civilizations were built on it. Empires depended on access to copper mines and tin mines and to the trade routes that brought these materials together. Iron is, in some ways, a much better metal than bronze. It is harder. It holds an edge longer. With proper working, heating, hammering, quenching, it can be made into weapons and tools that are superior in every way to bronze equivalents. But iron is much harder to work than bronze. The melting point of iron is much higher than the melting point of bronze. To work iron, you need higher temperatures, better furnaces, more sophisticated techniques. The pure smelting of iron, with the production of usable metal, was a technological challenge that took a long time to develop. The Hittites figured it out. We do not know exactly when. The earliest references to iron in Hittite texts date to the 14th century before the Common Era. By the 13th century, iron objects appear in Hittite contexts: daggers, ornamental items, ceremonial weapons. The Hittite kings sometimes sent iron objects as gifts to fellow rulers. There is a famous letter from a Hittite king to the pharaoh of Egypt, in which the Hittite politely declines a request for more iron, explaining that the working of iron is difficult and that the Hittites cannot produce as much as the pharaoh would like. This letter is sometimes interpreted as evidence that the Hittites kept the technology of ironworking a secret. They knew how to do it. Their neighbors did not. By restricting access to iron and its products, the Hittites maintained a strategic advantage over their rivals. There is some debate, today, about how decisive this advantage actually was. The Hittite iron objects we have found are relatively few. Most Hittite weapons we have are still bronze. The iron technology may have been more limited than the legend suggests. But the fact remains. The Hittites worked iron when their neighbors did not. They were, in a real sense, the pioneers of the Iron Age. And when their empire collapsed at the end of the Bronze Age, the technology of ironworking did not collapse with it. It spread outward, through the eastern Mediterranean, in the centuries after the Hittites were gone. The Iron Age, the age that would last from roughly 1200 before the Common Era to the rise of mass-produced steel in the modern period, has its earliest roots, in some sense, in Hittite Anatolia. A small empire, in a mountain country, figured out how to make a metal that would shape the next 3,000 years of human history. Religion was everywhere in Hittite life. The Hittites called their own religion the 1,000 Gods of Hatti. This was not an exaggeration. The Hittites worshipped, by their own count, more than 1,000 distinct deities. The gods came from every direction. Some were inherited from the original Hattian inhabitants. Some came from the Hurrian peoples to the south and east. Some came from Mesopotamia, brought home by Hittite kings who had campaigned there. Some came from Syria, from the Aegean, from the Caucasus. The Hittite religious system was, in a way, a record of everywhere the empire had reached. At the top of this enormous pantheon stood the storm god. The storm god, called Tarhunt in Hittite, Teshub in Hurrian, was the chief deity. He was the god of weather, of thunder, of fertilizing rain. He was the patron of kings and warriors. He was depicted as a bearded man, holding a lightning bolt in one hand and an axe in the other, sometimes standing on a bull, sometimes driving a chariot drawn by bulls. He was, in many ways, similar to the chief deities of other Indo-European pantheons, to Zeus in Greek mythology, to Jupiter in Roman, to Indra in Vedic Sanskrit. The storm god was the king of the gods, and his earthly counterpart was the king of the Hittites. Beside the storm god stood the sun goddess, called Aranite, or the sun goddess of Arina, after the city where her main temple was located. She was the consort of the storm god, and she was, in some ways, even more important than he was in the religious imagination of the Hittites. She was the goddess of the land, of fertility, of the queens of Hatti. The Hittite queens claimed her direct patronage. The queen of Hatti was, in a sense, the priestess of the sun goddess. Below the storm god and the sun goddess came a host of other major deities. There was a goddess of war, called Ishtar in some texts, called by Hurrian names in others. There was a god of the underworld. There was a god of the moon. There were patron deities for specific cities. Every Hittite city had its own god or goddess who watched over it. There were patron deities for specific occupations, for specific natural features, for specific kinds of agricultural work. The Hittite religious calendar was elaborate. Major festivals took place at regular intervals throughout the year. The king and queen presided over the most important rituals, traveling from city to perform them at the proper times. The festivals could last for weeks. They involved processions, sacrifices, recitations of mythological texts, the distribution of food and drink, the appearance of the king before his people. The temples, and Hattusa alone had more than 30 of them, were busy places. Priests performed daily rituals. Scribes recorded transactions. Cooks prepared the food offerings that would be presented to the gods. The temples were also significant economic institutions. They owned land, employed workers, ran businesses. A major temple was, in some ways, like a corporation, a large organization with its own staff, its own resources, and its own political influence. This was the religious world of the Hittite Empire. 1,000 gods. Hundreds of temples. Thousands of priests. An enormous, ongoing project of mediating between human beings and the divine forces that, in their understanding, governed every aspect of life. Beyond the king and the army and the gods, there were ordinary people living ordinary lives. A Hittite farmer, in the 14th century before the Common Era, lived in a small house with a flat roof and walls of mud brick. He grew barley and wheat, mostly. He raised goats and sheep. He had a few cattle for plowing and for milk. He owed labor to the local noble in exchange for the use of the land. In time of war, he served in the army, providing his own short sword, his own sling, his own provisions for a few weeks of campaign. His wife ground grain for bread, cooked over a small open hearth, looked after the children, kept the household garden. She had legal rights that were, by ancient standards, relatively significant. She could own property. She could initiate divorce, in some circumstances. she could inherit from her parents. Hittite women, particularly those of the higher classes, played a more prominent public role than women in most contemporary societies. The Queen of Hatti, the Tawananna, as she was titled, was a major political figure in her own right, not just a consort. Children were prized. The Hittite legal texts give substantial penalties for crimes against children. Mothers were expected to nurse their own babies. Wet nurses are mentioned but seem to have been used only when the mother could not. Children were taught the work of their parents. The farmer's son learned to farm. The scribe's son learned to write. There were some opportunities for social mobility, but they were limited. Most people lived the lives of their parents. Food was simple. Bread was the staple. Cheese, yogurt, occasional meat. Wine and beer were common drinks. The Hittites cultivated grapes, and beer was made from barley. The cuisine was richer than that of some of their neighbors. The influence of Mesopotamian and Syrian cooking is visible in some of the texts that have come down to us, including a number of recipes for stews and breads. Houses had courtyards. They had small altars for household worship. Every house honored its own household gods, in addition to the great public deities. They had storage rooms for grain and oil. They had sleeping quarters separated, more or less, from the working spaces. The life of an ordinary Hittite, a small farmer, a craftsman, a soldier, was, in many ways, recognizable. They worked hard. They worried about the weather. They paid taxes. They went to festivals. They loved their children. They feared death. They lit a small lamp at night, ate a simple meal with their families, slept on rough beds, and rose to work again the next morning. And then, in the late 13th century before the Common Era, they found themselves caught in the great storm that would destroy their world. We will come to that. We have reached the empire at its height. We have looked at the king, the army, the iron, the gods, the daily life. We have a picture, however incomplete, of what Hittite civilization actually was. In the next part, we are going to look at one specific event. The most famous event in Hittite history. The Battle of Kadesh in 1274 before the Common Era, and the peace treaty that followed it. This event matters for two reasons. First, it is the largest chariot battle in human history. The forces involved were enormous. The Egyptian pharaoh, Ramses II, fielded 20,000 men and perhaps 2,000 chariots. The Hittite king, Muwatalli II, fielded a comparable army, possibly larger. They met on a battlefield near the city of Kadesh, in what is now western Syria, and they fought for an entire afternoon in a chaos of dust and arrows and screaming horses. Second, the aftermath of the battle produced one of the great documents of antiquity. 16 years after the battle, the Hittite king Hattusa III and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II signed a formal peace treaty. The treaty was carved on silver tablets. Copies were kept in both capitals. The Hittite copy was found among the tablets at Hattusa. The Egyptian copy was carved into the walls of two major temples in Egypt. It is the first written peace treaty in human history. The earliest surviving document of formal diplomacy between two sovereign states. And it still matters today. A copy of it hangs in the United Nations building in New York, displayed as a reminder that the idea of negotiated peace between rivals has very old roots. That is the story for tomorrow night. In Hattusa, the evening is coming. The chariots are returning to their stables. The soldiers are eating their evening rations. The priests are finishing their last duties of the day in the great temples. The storm god watches from his shrine. The sun goddess is descending toward the horizon. The 1,000 gods of Hatti go about their business in the small ways that gods go about their business. The empire is at peace. For now. Tomorrow night, we go to Kadesh. We watch the chariots collide. We watch the dust rise. We watch two of the great empires of the ancient world meet in a battlefield, and we watch what happened afterward, the slow, careful, brilliant work of making peace. But tonight, rest. Good night. It is May, in the year 1274 before the Common Era. A young Egyptian pharaoh is leading his army northward. His name is Ramses II. He is 25 years old. He has been on the throne for 5 years. He has decided, in this 5th year of his reign, that he is going to do what his father failed to do. He is going to reconquer the city of Kadesh in northern Syria and re-establish Egyptian control over the lands that the Hittites have been chipping away at for decades. He marches with an army of 20,000 men. The army is divided into 4 divisions, named after Egyptian gods: Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Sutek. Each division has roughly 5,000 foot soldiers and 500 chariots. They march in formation, day after day, through Sinai, up the Mediterranean coast, into the Levant. By the end of May, they have reached the headwaters of the Orontes River. Kadesh, the city they have come to take, is somewhere in front of them, on the western side of the Orontes, perhaps a day's march away. What Ramses does not know is that the Hittite king is waiting for him. The Hittite king is named Muwatalli II. He has gathered an even larger army, perhaps 25,000 or 30,000 men, with as many as 3,000 chariots. He has marched south from Hattusa, gathering troops along the way. He has assembled a coalition of every subject kingdom in northern Syria and southeastern Anatolia. He has, in some sense, the entire Hittite Empire on the field with him. He has positioned his army carefully. He has hidden the bulk of his forces behind the city of Kadesh, where they cannot be seen from the Egyptian approach. He has sent forward 2 Bedouin spies who are going to surrender to the Egyptians and feed them false information. He is, by the standards of his time, conducting a masterclass in military deception. What is about to happen on this hot May afternoon is going to be one of the largest battles in the history of the ancient world. The 2 Bedouin spies are captured by the Egyptian advance scouts. They are brought before Ramses. They tell him what they have been instructed to tell him. They say that the Hittite king is far away, many days' march to the north, near a city called Aleppo. They say that the Hittite army is not nearby. They say that the road to Kadesh is open. Ramses believes them. He gives the order to advance. The leading division, the division of Amun, in which Ramses himself is traveling, pushes forward at speed, eager to seize Kadesh before the Hittites can react. The other 3 divisions, Ra, Ptah, and Sutek, are strung out behind, miles apart on the road, separated by the river and by the marshy terrain along it. The Egyptian army, which had been compact and disciplined, is now spread out across half a day's march of road, with the leading division dangerously isolated. Ramses, with the division of Amun, reaches the area north of Kadesh by late morning. He sets up a temporary camp. He waits for the other divisions to arrive. He sends scouts forward to investigate the city. The scouts capture 2 more men. These are real Hittite scouts, this time, and they are real prisoners. Under interrogation, probably involving torture, they tell the truth. The Hittite army is not far away near Aleppo. The Hittite army is right here, hidden behind the city of Kadesh, waiting in ambush. Ramses realizes, in this moment, that he has been catastrophically deceived. The leading division of his army is alone, dug in around a half-built camp with 3 other divisions hours away. The Hittite army is about to fall on him with overwhelming force. He sends frantic messages to the rear. The division of Ra, the 2nd division, is the closest. It is being summoned to advance at speed. But it is going to be too late. The Hittite chariots are already moving. The Hittite chariots emerge from behind the city of Kadesh, cross the Orontes River at a ford that the Egyptians had not properly scouted, and slam into the marching column of the division of Ra. The division of Ra is destroyed. This is not an exaggeration. The Egyptian division, caught in marching order, with its chariots in column rather than in line, with its foot soldiers strung out and unable to form up, is overrun by the Hittite chariot charge in a matter of minutes. The Egyptian soldiers panic. Many are killed where they stand. The survivors flee northward, toward the camp where Ramses and the division of Amun are waiting. The fleeing Egyptians, in their panic, run straight into the Egyptian camp. They spread the panic. The division of Amun, which had been preparing for battle but in good order, begins to disintegrate. Soldiers throw away their weapons. Wagons are abandoned. The whole northern edge of the Egyptian position is in chaos. The Hittite chariots, having destroyed the division of Ra, continue forward into the camp itself. They are now charging into a disordered Egyptian force, half of whom are fleeing. By any reasonable military analysis, the battle should be over. The Egyptian army should be destroyed. Ramses, the young pharaoh, should be captured or killed. This is the moment when the story becomes legendary. According to the Egyptian accounts, and we have several, all of them carved into temple walls or written on papyrus, all of them composed by scribes working for Ramses, the pharaoh personally rallied the remaining troops. He mounted his chariot. He grabbed his bow. He charged, almost alone, into the mass of Hittite chariots that were swarming through the camp. He cut his way back and forth across the battlefield, killing dozens of enemies with his own hand, while the gods Amun and Ra watched over him. The Egyptian propaganda is, of course, exaggerated. Ramses did not personally kill dozens of Hittites. He did not, single-handedly, turn the battle around. But something happened. The battle did not, in fact, end as it should have ended. Several factors converged. First, the Hittite chariots, once they got into the Egyptian camp, lost their discipline. Many of them stopped to loot. The Hittite charge, which had been irresistible on the open plain, dissolved into a chaotic scramble for valuables. This is a recurring problem with Bronze Age armies. Looting was, in some sense, the point. Soldiers expected to enrich themselves from the spoils of battle. But when the looting starts before the enemy is finished, the battle can suddenly reverse. Second, the 3rd Egyptian division, the division of Parta, arrived from the south, unexpectedly. It marched into the rear of the disordered Hittite chariots. Ramses, by accident or by skill, had a fresh formation arrive at exactly the moment when he most needed it. The Hittite chariots, caught between the rallying division of Amun in front and the fresh division of Parta behind, were suddenly in a bad position. Many were killed. Many were captured. Many fled back toward the city. Third, the Hittite king, Muwatalli, made a decision. He had committed his chariot corps to the assault on the Egyptian camp. He had not committed his infantry, which had been held in reserve. Now, with his chariots in chaos, he had to decide whether to send the infantry in to finish the job, or to hold them back and live to fight another day. He held them back. This may have been a mistake. It is also possible that, by the time he could have committed the infantry, the moment had passed. Either way, the Hittite infantry never crossed the Orontes. The battle, which should have been a Hittite victory, became a Hittite withdrawal. By evening, the field was clear. The Egyptian camp had been damaged but not destroyed. The remaining Egyptian forces, the divisions of Amun and Partar, plus the scattered survivors of Ra, had reorganized. The 4th Division, Sutek, was still on the road and arrived late in the evening. The Hittite army had withdrawn back across the Orontes into Kadesh and the surrounding terrain. Ramses, in the days that followed, claimed total victory. He had, after all, held the field. The Egyptian army had not been destroyed. The pharaoh himself was alive and uninjured. By the conventions of his time, this counted as a win. The temple inscriptions back in Egypt, when they were carved over the next several years, presented the Battle of Kadesh as one of the greatest victories in Egyptian history. Ramses had defeated the Hittites. Ramses had been protected by the gods. Ramses had earned his place in eternity. The Hittites told a different story. Muwatalli also claimed victory. He had, after all, destroyed an Egyptian division. He had held Kadesh. He had forced the Egyptians to withdraw. By his standards, he had won. Modern historians, looking at all the evidence, Egyptian and Hittite, generally judge the battle to have been a tactical draw. Neither side achieved a decisive victory. Both sides suffered heavy casualties. The strategic outcome favored the Hittites slightly, because Kadesh remained under Hittite influence after the battle, and the Egyptian dream of reconquering Syria was effectively ended. Ramses retreated south. The campaign was over. But here is the strange thing. The Battle of Kadesh, despite its inconclusive military outcome, has become one of the most famous battles in history. It is the largest chariot battle ever fought. It is one of the earliest battles for which we have detailed written accounts from both sides. It is, in a real sense, where the documented military history of the world begins. And, perhaps even more importantly, it is the battle that produced the first peace treaty. After Kadesh, there were 16 years of Cold War. The Hittites and the Egyptians did not, in those years, fight any major battles. But they did not make peace either. They continued to compete for influence in northern Syria. They funded each other's enemies. They engaged in proxy wars through the smaller kingdoms of the region. They sent diplomatic letters that were technically polite but contained barely concealed threats. In Egypt, Ramses continued to rule. He built monuments. He carved more inscriptions about his victory at Kadesh. He fathered many children, perhaps 100, by many wives. He aged. In Hatti, Muwatalli died. The succession was contested. A son named Mursili III took the throne. He ruled briefly and badly. Then, after about 7 years, he was deposed by his uncle, Hattusa, the brother of Muwatalli, who had been a key general at Kadesh. Hattusa III now took the throne of the Hittite Empire. Hattusa was a different kind of king. He had spent his career on the frontiers, dealing with rebellious provinces and aggressive neighbors. He understood, perhaps better than his predecessor, that the empire could not afford to maintain perpetual war with Egypt while simultaneously dealing with threats from the Assyrians to the east, from the Kaskad tribes to the north, and from the growing power of the Mycenaean Greeks in the west. He needed to neutralize one of his enemies. The most logical candidate was Egypt. And in Egypt, Ramses was getting older. He had ruled for more than 20 years by now. He had achieved much of what a pharaoh was supposed to achieve. The reconquest of Syria, the dream of his youth, had not happened. It probably was not going to happen. He, too, had reason to want peace. In 1259 before the Common Era, 16 years after the Battle of Kadesh, the two kings did something remarkable. They negotiated, formally and publicly, a peace treaty. The treaty was carved on tablets of silver. This was unusual. Most treaties of the period were inscribed on clay or, at most, on stone. Silver was a sign of how important this document was. Both sides wanted it to be permanent. Both sides wanted it to be remembered. The Egyptian copy of the treaty was carried to the temple of Karnak in Egypt and carved into the temple walls in hieroglyphics. The Hittite copy was carried to Hattusa and stored in the royal archive, where Hugo Winkler would find it almost 3,000 years later. Both texts have survived. We have both versions. The contents of the treaty are precisely what you would expect of a serious diplomatic document. The two kings, Hattusili and Ramses, declare a state of permanent peace between their two kingdoms. They renounce all claims against each other's territory. They establish that the existing borders are to be respected. They agree to mutual non-aggression. Neither side will invade the other, neither side will support the other's enemies. They agree to extradition. Fugitives from either kingdom will be returned to the rulers from whom they have fled. Political opponents of Ramses cannot find refuge in Hatti. Political opponents of Hattusili cannot find refuge in Egypt. Both kings will police their own borders against the other's troublemakers. They agree to mutual defense. If either kingdom is attacked by a third party, the other will come to its aid. This is a real military alliance, with real obligations on both sides. It is the first formal alliance of this kind that we have documentary evidence for. They agree to succession. Both kings recognize each other's chosen heirs. They commit to supporting the successor of the other king if any rebellion should challenge the succession. They are, in a sense, providing each other with insurance against domestic instability. And they invoke their gods. This is the part that is most striking to modern eyes. The treaty is not just a political document. It is a religious one. Both kings call upon all the gods of both pantheons, the 1,000 gods of Hatti and the gods of Egypt, to witness the agreement. They invoke specific deities by name. They specify the curses that will fall upon any party who violates the agreement. The treaty is, at one and the same time, a legal contract, a diplomatic understanding, and a sacred oath. The two kings did not just promise each other peace. They promised the gods. The Treaty of Kadesh held. For more than 50 years, until both empires were collapsing for unrelated reasons, the peace between Hatti and Egypt was maintained. There were no more wars. There were no more major frontier skirmishes. There were, instead, marriages. Hattusili sent his daughter to be a wife of Ramses, and the inscriptions celebrating her arrival in Egypt show her treated with extraordinary honor. There was trade. There were exchanges of letters between the two royal families that have the warmth of genuine friendship, the elderly Ramses and the elderly Hattusili writing to each other about their families, their health, their children. Two of the great powers of the ancient world had figured out, against the odds, that they could live in peace. They had built the institutional framework, the diplomatic relations, the legal commitments, the religious oaths, that could sustain that peace across decades. This was an achievement. It was also, in some sense, a model. 3,000 years later, when modern diplomats are negotiating peace treaties, when the United Nations is being founded, when nuclear powers are signing arms control agreements, when warring states are trying to figure out how to coexist, they are working in a tradition that begins in the documentary record with Hattusa III and Ramses II. The forms have changed. The principles have not. A copy of the Treaty of Kadesh, in a translation, on a plaque, hangs today in the headquarters of the United Nations in New York. It is presented there as a reminder. The idea of negotiated peace between sovereign states is not a modern invention. It is more than 3,000 years old. It has been done before. It can be done again. The two empires that did it first, both of them, are now gone. Egypt has continued, in various forms, into the modern world. Hatti has not. The Hittite Empire collapsed less than 100 years after the treaty was signed. The collapse, and the strange silence that followed, is the subject of our final part. In the archives at Hattusa, the Silver Treaty has long since been melted down. We do not have it. What we have is the clay tablet that recorded its text, baked accidentally to permanence by the fire that destroyed the city. A scribe pressed the marks into the clay, line by careful line. He recorded the names of the kings. He recorded the names of the gods. He recorded the promises that the two empires had made to each other. He did not know that the empire that had made the treaty would, within his children's lifetimes, no longer exist. Tomorrow night, we come to the end. The collapse. The Sea Peoples. The fires that destroyed Hattusa and a dozen other cities across the eastern Mediterranean. The strange, sudden, almost simultaneous end of the entire Bronze Age world. But tonight, rest. Good night. Sometime around the year 1200 before the Common Era, something terrible began to happen across the eastern Mediterranean. Cities began to burn. Not just one city. Not just one region. Across an enormous geographic area, from the western coast of Anatolia to the borders of Egypt, major cities were destroyed by fire within the space of a few decades. The destruction was so widespread, so simultaneous, so thorough that scholars today refer to it by a single name. They call it the Late Bronze Age collapse. Mycenae, in Greece, was destroyed. Pylos, on the western Peloponnese, was destroyed. Tiryns, Thebes, Knossos, all destroyed or severely damaged. The Mycenaean civilization, which had dominated the Aegean for centuries, simply ceased to exist. Its writing system, Linear B, was forgotten. Its palaces became ruins. Troy was destroyed. The seventh level of the city of Troy, the Troy that classical Greeks would later remember as the city of Priam, the city that Homer's heroes besieged, was burned to the ground around this time. Ugarit, the great Syrian trading city on the Mediterranean coast, was destroyed. The last letters from Ugarit, written on clay tablets that the scribes never finished baking, beg for help. They describe enemies coming from the sea. They describe the fleet being away. They describe the city being unable to defend itself. The tablets sit, half-finished, in the ruins, and the city was burned around them. And Hattusa, the great capital of the Hittite Empire, was destroyed. The end of Hattusa came suddenly. We do not have a precise date. The best estimate is somewhere around 1180 before the Common Era, though it could have been a decade or two earlier or later. But the archaeological evidence is clear about what happened. The city had been prepared, in the months or years before the end, for siege or evacuation. The most valuable contents of the temples, the cult statues, the religious vessels, the precious metals, had been packed up and moved. The royal archives had been combed for the most important documents, which were taken away. The wine cellars had been emptied. Even the grain stores had been reduced. Whoever was responsible for the final defense of the city knew that something was coming. They were trying to save what they could. And then, sometime in this period of preparation or shortly after it, the city was set on fire. The destruction was thorough. The palaces, the temples, the residential quarters, the city walls, almost everything was burned. The fires were so intense that the mud brick walls baked solid, and the clay tablets in the libraries were baked too, which is why so many of them have survived. The fire that destroyed Hattusa is the reason we know so much about the Hittites. Without that fire, the tablets would have crumbled to dust over the millennia, and we would never have heard their story. The fire was set by someone. We do not know exactly by whom. There are several possibilities, and they may all be true, in different combinations. One possibility is that the Hittites themselves set the fire. Faced with imminent attack, with the population already evacuated to more defensible positions, the last defenders may have torched their own capital rather than leave it intact for an enemy. This is what the Russians did to Moscow in 1812. It is what the Carthaginians did to Carthage when Rome captured it. The deliberate destruction of one's own city, to deny it to the enemy, is a recurring pattern in ancient warfare. A second possibility is that the city was attacked and overrun, and the attackers burned it. This is the more conventional explanation. Some hostile force, perhaps the Sea Peoples, perhaps internal rebels, perhaps the Kaska tribes from the northern mountains, overcame the last defenses and put the city to the torch. A third possibility, which is increasingly favored by archaeologists, is some combination of both. The city was abandoned, in part. It was overrun, in part. It was burned, in some combination of self-destruction by the last Hittites and destruction by their enemies. What is certain is that, after the fire, Hattusa was gone. Not destroyed and rebuilt. Not damaged and reduced. Gone. The site was abandoned. The empire was abandoned. The Hittite kings, if any of them survived the destruction of their capital, never re-established their authority. Within a generation, the Hittite Empire had ceased to exist as a political entity. So who did this? Who burned Hattusa, and Ugarit, and Mycenae, and a dozen other major cities across the eastern Mediterranean? The Egyptians, who were among the few major powers to survive the collapse, left us a name for them. They called them the Sea Peoples. The name comes from the inscriptions of the pharaoh Ramses III, not the same Ramses we have already met, but a later pharaoh of the next dynasty, ruling about 70 years later. Ramses III fought a series of campaigns against invaders who, according to his accounts, came from the sea. They moved in fleets of ships. They were accompanied by their families, in ox carts, suggesting that they were migrating peoples rather than just raiding warriors. They had displaced themselves from their original homes and were looking for new ones, by force. Ramses III defeated the Sea Peoples in a great battle in the Nile Delta, around 1175 before the Common Era. He carved descriptions and images of the battle into the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, near Thebes. The images are still there. They show ships meeting ships in a chaotic naval battle. They show prisoners being led away. They show the pharaoh standing victorious over fallen enemies. They are some of our best evidence for who the Sea Peoples were, what they looked like, what they fought with. But who were they, really? This is one of the great unanswered questions of ancient history. The Egyptian inscriptions list several distinct groups by name: the Pele Set, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh, the Shiaden. Some of these names can be tentatively identified with later groups. The Pele Set, for example, are usually identified with the Philistines who would soon settle on the southern Levantine coast, the people of Goliath, from the Hebrew Bible. The Shiaden may be the ancestors of the people who later gave their name to Sardinia. The Shekelesh may be related to Sicily. But these identifications are speculative. The Sea peoples may have come from the Aegean. They may have come from southern Anatolia. They may have come from Sardinia and Sicily and southern Italy. They may have been refugees from places that had themselves been destroyed earlier in the collapse. They may have been a coalition of multiple peoples, with multiple origins, moving together because they had nowhere else to go. We do not know. What we know is that they appeared, suddenly, in the late 13th and early 12th centuries before the Common Era. They moved by sea and by land. They destroyed cities. They were finally stopped, at the gates of Egypt, by Ramses III. And then they either dispersed, or settled, or merged with the surviving populations of the lands they had passed through. They did not, however, cause the Late Bronze Age collapse single-handedly. They were probably one symptom of a much larger problem, rather than the cause of it. The Late Bronze Age collapse is, in some ways, the most disputed problem in ancient Mediterranean history. Why did so many civilizations fall, at roughly the same time, across such a wide area? The Sea peoples cannot be the whole answer. They are not big enough or organized enough to have destroyed everything by themselves. Modern scholars have proposed many contributing factors. There was climate change. The Eastern Mediterranean experienced, in the centuries around 1200 before the Common Era, a significant period of drying. Rainfall decreased. Crops failed. Famine spread. The ability of the Bronze Age states to feed their populations was strained, and in some places it broke. The pollen records from lake beds across the region show this drying clearly. It was real, and it was probably an important contributing factor. There was earthquake activity. The Eastern Mediterranean lies on active tectonic plates, and there is evidence of a cluster of major earthquakes in the late 13th and early 12th centuries. Several Bronze Age cities show damage consistent with seismic destruction immediately before their final abandonment. Earthquakes alone do not destroy civilizations, but they can stress already fragile systems beyond their breaking point. There was systemic interdependence. The Late Bronze Age was a remarkably interconnected world. The major kingdoms, Egypt, Hatti, Mycenae, Mesopotamia, Cyprus, depended on each other for trade. Tin came from one source. Copper came from another. Grain moved from regions of surplus to regions of need. Luxury goods circulated through long-distance networks. When one part of this system broke, the others were vulnerable. A disruption to the tin trade, for example, could ripple outward and weaken every kingdom that depended on bronze for its weapons and tools. There were internal stresses. The major Bronze Age kingdoms were administered by elaborate bureaucracies, supported by extensive infrastructure, sustained by complex tax systems. They were vulnerable to internal failures. A succession crisis, a peasant rebellion, an aristocratic conspiracy, any of these could weaken a state, and several states weakened at the same time could fail together. And there were the migrations. As the Bronze Age system began to break down, populations began to move. The Sea Peoples were one such migration. There were almost certainly others, on land, that have left less archaeological evidence. People who had been settled for centuries began to move in search of food, security, opportunity. As they moved, they put pressure on the regions they passed through. The pressure could collapse already stressed states. The picture that emerges from a century of scholarship is something like this. The Late Bronze Age collapse was not caused by a single thing. It was caused by many things happening at once, reinforcing each other. Climate change weakened the agricultural base. Earthquakes destroyed key infrastructure. Trade networks broke down. Internal political crises consumed several states. Migrating peoples added pressure from outside. The whole system, which had functioned for centuries, came apart in a few decades. The Hittites, who had been one of the most successful states of the Late Bronze Age, were not exempt from any of these problems. They had to deal with drought. They had to deal with rebellious provinces. They had to deal with the Sea Peoples and other migrating groups pressing in from multiple directions. They could not deal with all of it at once. They collapsed. After the destruction of Hattusa, the Hittites disappeared from history. Not literally. Not entirely. Some Hittites survived. The descendants of the imperial population continued to live in central Anatolia, in smaller settlements, with simpler political structures. They are sometimes called Neo-Hittites by modern historians. They kept some of the old language. They kept some of the old religion. They built a series of small principalities in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria, which lasted for several centuries before being absorbed by the rising power of the Assyrians. But the Hittite Empire, the great power that had fought Egypt at Kadesh, that had signed the first written peace treaty in history, that had ruled half of Anatolia, was gone. Its capital was abandoned. Its archives were buried. Its language stopped being widely spoken. Within a few centuries, almost no one in the region remembered who the Hittites had been. The references in other people's records, the Egyptian inscriptions, the Bible, the Assyrian chronicles, did not vanish. They were preserved. But the people the references were about, the actual Hittites, had become a name without a country, a name without a meaning. Classical Greek and Roman writers, when they encountered the term, did not know what to do with it. The Bible's Hittites were assumed to be some minor Canaanite people of no particular importance. The Egyptian temple inscriptions about the great Hittite Empire became inscrutable. For 3,000 years, the Hittites were forgotten. 3,000 years is a long time. To put it in perspective, when Hugo Winkler began digging at Hattusa in 1906, more time had passed between the fall of the Hittite Empire and the present than has passed between the present and ancient Rome. The Hittites had been gone for longer than the time between Caesar and us. They had been forgotten through the rise and fall of Egypt, the rise of the Assyrian Empire, the rise of the Persian Empire, the rise and fall of Rome, the rise of the Byzantine Empire, the spread of Islam, the entire history of the Ottoman Empire. All of this happened on top of the Hittites, and they were not remembered until almost the modern era. Then a German scholar, with a tip from antique dealers, dug into a Turkish hillside and found the tablets. And the empire that had been silent for 3,000 years began, slowly, to speak. 100 years of work has now gone into the recovery of Hittite civilization. The tablets have mostly been translated, though some remain. The language has been reconstructed in great detail. The royal chronologies have been pieced together. The art and architecture have been studied. The religion has been mapped, the legal system has been described, the daily life has been imagined. There is still much we do not know. The tablets, despite their numbers, are skewed toward administrative and royal matters. We do not have, from the Hittites, an extensive body of poetry or epic literature. We do not have personal letters in any significant numbers. We do not have novels or plays or autobiographies. We know the Hittites mostly through their officials, their priests, their kings, through the kinds of texts that they thought worth preserving in royal archives. We know less about ordinary Hittite life than we would like. We do not know what the average Hittite farmer thought about the world. We do not know what stories he told his children at night. We do not know how he understood his place in the cosmos, beyond what we can infer from the formal religious texts. The ordinary life of the empire is, for the most part, still silent. But what we have is enormous, and it is being added to. Excavations continue at Hattusa and at other Hittite sites. New tablets are still being found and translated. New techniques, chemical analysis of pottery, DNA studies of human remains, satellite mapping of the landscape, are revealing aspects of Hittite life that the texts alone cannot show. Every decade, we know more about them than we did before. The Hittites are, in some sense, still emerging from their 3,000 years of silence. They are not yet fully restored. They may never be. But what we have, we have. The empire that thought itself eternal, that built its capital in the mountains and signed treaties with the gods, has at least been allowed to speak again, however incompletely, in its own voice. What does it mean that the Hittites were forgotten? It means, first of all, that being forgotten is possible. Even great civilizations can disappear. Even successful empires can leave so little trace that their existence is doubted for thousands of years. The Hittite Empire was not small. It was not unsuccessful. It was, at its height, one of the four great powers of the late Bronze Age world. And yet, within a few centuries of its fall, its own name was no longer associated with any specific people or place. It had to be rediscovered, almost from nothing. This is a humbling thought. We tend to assume, in our own time, that what we build will be remembered. We tend to assume that our cities, our institutions, our names will persist. The Hittites would have made the same assumption. They were wrong. It means, also, that recovery is possible. The Hittites are not, after all, lost. Their tablets have been read. Their language has been reconstructed. Their kings have been named. Their treaties have been translated. They have, in a real sense, been given back to us. The work of historians and archaeologists over the past century has rebuilt a civilization that had been almost entirely erased. This is, in its way, a hopeful thought. What is lost can sometimes be found again. What is silent can sometimes be made to speak. The work is slow and difficult and incomplete, but it is possible. And it means that the present is not as solid as it feels. 3,000 years from now, our own civilization will be ancient. Some of what we have built will be remembered. Some will be forgotten. Some will have to be rediscovered by future archaeologists, sifting through whatever remains. The Hittites teach us, if we let them, that history is longer than memory. The treaty that Hattusa and Ramses signed in 1259 before the Common Era is, in some way, still in force. It has outlasted both of the empires that made it. It has outlasted the languages it was originally written in. It has outlasted the gods who were invoked to enforce it. It has been silent, and it has been heard again. It will, perhaps, be heard for a long time yet. There is a German archaeologist in 1906 on a hillside in central Turkey. He does not know what he is about to find. He cannot know. He cannot know that the cuneiform tablets he is going to pull out of the ground will rewrite the history of an entire region. He cannot know that the empire he is about to rediscover has been waiting, silent, under the soil, for 3,000 years. He cannot know that the workers around him are standing on the bones of one of the great civilizations of the ancient world. He begins to dig. Within days, the first tablet emerges. Within weeks, by the thousand. Within months, by the cartload. The empire that had been forgotten for 3,000 years begins, slowly, to come back into view. The tablets are unreadable, at first. The language is a mystery. It will be 9 years before Bedřich Hrozný, working in Vienna during the First World War, breaks the code. It will be decades before the chronology is established, the kings are named, the diplomatic correspondence is set in order. The work continues, even now. Even tonight. Somewhere, in a museum, the Treaty of Kadesh sits in its glass case. The clay tablet on which the scribe pressed his careful wedges. The first written peace between sovereign states. 3,300 years old. The gods who were called to witness it are gone. The kings who signed it are dust. The empires that made it have vanished into the deep past. But the words remain. That is something. That, perhaps, is everything. The night is deep. You have been listening. That is what matters. Good night.